Let me start by giving everyone a little bit of introduction. Although they've been given your article to read, some of us have seen, some of your videos, some of us have read your books. And that's how I got to know about Alastair in, I believe it was 2016. I was gifted this book, 2016, Christmas 2016. And it was Ian Hall. Some of you remember Ian Hall? He was English. He lived in Sabah for a long time. And then he went back to the UK and he went to work in the Isle of Skye. And he came across this book and he thought of me, apparently, and he sent me a copy by post. I was like, okay, Soil and Soul. And I didn't read it for a while, and then all of a sudden I read it, and then I couldn't put it down. It changed my life. I know that sounds cliched, but really, really profound, deep book about Alastair's journey as a young child, indigenous child in Scotland, his journey, and then becoming a campaigner, and particularly a couple of campaigns, but the one that I remembered most was where an island, the Isle of Egg, is that how you say it, Egg? The Isle of Egg?
Egg, yes.
EIGG, where it used to be owned by the Orang Besar, by the elites, and that's where they go and have their parties and their hunting. And then in the campaign that he was a part of, the communities, the indigenous people of that place reclaimed it and bought it back from this, what do they call them? Lords, landowner, bairds, lairds.
The laird.
The laird.
Word for lord.
And it was so profound, and what I loved was how political and poetic and luscious and deep the language was, and it just took me on a journey, so much so that I wanted to go to the Isle of Egg, and I went. So as it happens, the funder who funds our work here in Forever Sabah Institute, the Full Circle Foundation, knew of Alastair and connected us by email. And I said, I want to go to the Isle of Egg. And so it so happened that was the year of the 20th celebration of the community getting back the land. And so they were having big celebrations on Egg. So Ken and I and Ian wanted to come too. So we all went to Isle of Egg and joined in the celebrations, which was just beautiful. And there's like bagpipes receiving us, and we stayed there. Oh my God, it was like magical. And they gave us it was at first they were saying there's no more space. But then because of Alastair, suddenly there was space for us. And so we celebrated with them, and it was just so beautiful. Alastair gave me this book. His next book is another book called The Poacher's Pilgrimage, An Island Journey. Beautiful. So any one of you want to look at it later, it's here. So I mean, why am I talking when he's there, right? I'm going to hand it over to you, Alastair. And we're super excited about just hearing from you. And then hopefully towards the end, maybe some questions from everyone here. There's about 30 of us. And ranging from basically intergenerational, all ages, very diverse, all doing some kind of troublemaking somewhere with art, with ecology, with, I don't know, everything, planting trees, you name it. So over to you. Thank you.
And in putting together this presentation today, there's some very deep material. So I'm going to take probably more like the hour to share with you. And I'm going to move now into screen share because my presentation is very visual. Cynthia talked about my work on the Isle of Egg. I am actually going to speak to you more about the work on an island close to Egg called the Isle of Harris, which is part of two islands, Lewis and Harris, where I grew up. And the reason I'm going to focus in on that is that it is easier for me to bring out the deep ecology and the ecofeminism, because I am not going to give you a lecture on what ecofeminism and deep ecology are. I'm only going to touch briefly on that. Instead, I am going to try and show you through my work. Now, before I go any further, can I just check that you are hearing and understanding me clearly the way I am speaking just now? Yes, do I see thumbs up? Magic, magic. Oh, it's so nice to see you all there. My goodness me. My goodness, it is so nice to see your faces. Ha ha. You have important work to do, friends. I remember on an island in West Papua, an old woman called Mama Wanma came up to us. We were all lying about on the beach. And she said, sit up, pay attention. Your lives are important. You have got important work to do. Pay attention. And then she spoke. And my goodness, I often think of Mama Wanma's lesson. Pay attention. You have got important work to do. Do not waste your life. Step into your life. Now let me go into share screen if I can here. Okay, oops, wrong slide. Can you see that okay? Yep. Okay, so I'm going to talk about Scotland here. I'm going to talk about ecofeminism and deep ecology. I have a lot of slides. I'm only going to say one or two sentences for most of them. So I grew up on the Isle of Lewis here in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland. The Isle of Harris is part of the same landmass, but separated by mountains here. And the Isle of Egg that Cynthia was talking about is down here. That's the Isle of Skye in the Scottish Outer Hebrides. We are a community that lives very close to the land and to the sea. Growing up, we worked on the land. My father was a doctor, but I was involved in the local community. We're always out in boats fishing. It was partly a subsistence economy, partly indigenous, partly non-indigenous. One of the things about an indigenous society is that if you look at my friend, that's me and my sister there coming back from a fishing trip. If you look at my friend, Alec George Morrison there you see him again. There's us as we are today, and another friend from our village in the background here. You have friends for life, not just friends on Facebook that you like or unlike. This gives very strong connections between people and place. If you ask me what indigenous means, I would say it is being strongly connected as communities of place. Note that expression, communities of place. You grow up in a way that is not just horizontally connected geographically, but also vertically connected through people. Everybody is aware of who their people are, where they have come from. There is intergenerational mentoring. These are all old people that I knew, sorry, these ones and total here, old people who I knew when I was young. These are the people who raised us. And if you look at these faces, or at my ancestors here, you can see the indigenous in their faces and also in their bodies and their physique. These people are people who work hard on the land. That is how it is when I was a boy. Now, when I was 22, I applied to do voluntary service overseas. And I got sent to the Gulf province here in Papua New Guinea for 2 years. I subsequently spent 4 years there. I'm assuming that I'm being heard loud and clear, and that if I'm not, somebody will start waving madly in front of me. So in Papua New Guinea, I encountered a Melanesian culture, a very different culture. But the irony was, and this is an important point, that growing up in Scotland, I was not aware that we were an indigenous culture. I was not aware of our own culture because, like a fish in water, I had never been taken out of it. But when I went to live in Papua New Guinea and I learned about their culture, that also taught me about my own. So much of my work has been informed by the 4 years I spent in Papua New Guinea, first at the age of 22 there, as a teacher in the school, and then later on doing small-scale hydroelectric in the mountains of the Gulf province. I learned so much from these people, as well as sharing my own skills with them. But it was while there, and I'm talking now into the mid-1980s, it was while there that we became aware that the place was being destroyed. Logging companies were coming in, corrupting local officials, bribing the politicians, corrupting democracy. We said that logging perverted democracy in Papua New Guinea. Similarly, with fishing, the people's livelihood being taken away from them by foreign fishing boats, mainly from Taiwan, that were coming in to Papua New Guinea, again through corrupt processes. And then areas where mining, without proper environmental safeguards and without the consent of indigenous people, was destroying the place. And here at the Bougainville mine, the Panguna mine in Bougainville, led to civil war and continuing political unrest, moving to transformation in that area. So you can imagine my shock when I came back to Scotland after my second term in Papua New Guinea in 1986, to learn that there was a proposal to mine this mountain, the highest mountain in the south of our island of Lewis and Harris. And they were going to cut the belly out. They're going to cut out all of this and take it away on ships. You can imagine my disturbance having seen this in Papua New Guinea and coming home to Scotland and finding that the same global processes of an extractive economy were applying here. Here is a corporate chief put in place to manage it, John Levers. Notice there is where the seaport would have been built. Notice how the sign to the village here, he has taken a spanner and he has lowered the sign down so that he can place his hand over it. And he's turned the sign around as if to show that he owns the place. They put out this publicity, the facts about the coastal quarry. And you can see there is no beauty in that picture. It's been taken from the sea. It's been made to look as if it would not be visible from most of the island, as if it would have no effect. But there is a mountain. There is a mountain with a medieval church, where, according to local tradition, sacred practices have been carried out here, going back to the time of the Druids, going back to the pre-Christian indigenous times. On this site, the church built in the medieval period, several hundred years old. A sacred natural site, as we would now understand it to be, in front of this beautiful mountain that you see here. And what they wanted to do was they wanted to take away the stone in the mountain. They wanted to eat up our islands, to build more and more motorways, more and more roads, especially in the south of England, and maybe even exporting the rock to Europe or even to America. You will know the familiar story in your part of the world too. Well, there is an air photograph of the side of the mountain where they would have the quarry. Most of the rock is bare because of the Ice Age, but you can see in the background, it's an island with beautiful beaches. It's what many people would call wild land, with small indigenous settlements. There's the village, or one of the villages there. And here is what the quarry would look like after 30 years of operation. The rock is very white. There would be the export, the marine facilities to ship it out. Purely taking away the rock of the island. And although they initially said there would be 500 jobs created, when the government inquiry was carried out, it turned out that only 35 jobs would be local. There would be little benefit to the island, but a loss of place identity and belonging to place. So how are we going to stop it? How are we going to stop it? Remember, I had just come back from Papua New Guinea. I had grown up in this place, in this island. And that was when I started to think about what I had learned in Papua New Guinea. This is Mama Miriam Layton. And she said to me, Alastair, tell me about land in Scotland. And I said, well, most of us do not own any land. The land is owned by big landowners who use it for exploitation. She said, but I thought you white people were all rich. How can you be rich if your communities do not own the land? You see, such an important thing, she said to me. And it was as if her power was helping me to carry me. Another person was Margaret Ogumeni, the Director of Extension in the South Pacific Appropriate Technology Foundation, which in the 1980s I was working for. And Margaret Ogumeni was drawing on the teachings of Paulo Freire of Brazil and drawing on liberation theology. I'll say more about that later. Theology that liberates theology to liberate people. And she was questioning what kind of development? What kind of development? This is a graphic from the Solomon Islands Development Trust that Margaret was, we were all involved, these South Pacific organizations all working together. And in the first caption here, you see the expatriate man, the man from outside the community, arriving in the village, and on that, on his back there, he's got a chainsaw and it says development plan. But notice a chainsaw and look at the village. Everybody working, their house is in good condition. Next, the trees are all cut down because the logging came in. Now the man is drinking the money. The woman is doing all the work. Notice the gender changing there. This is important in understanding what ecofeminism is saying, how certain mindsets, how domination mindsets lead to gender inequality. The child is now no longer helping with the life of the village, but probably getting bored. The house is starting to fall apart. And the fishing contract. This time the man's got the fishing contract, and Saltai is a play on what was that? Taiwan Solomons. It was one of the fishing companies operating at that time. And now they're even more destitute. Now both the man and the woman are drinking. All the child can do is look at what in Papua New Guinea they call the fruits of the white man's garden. The fruits of the white man's garden. Look at the digger. The gold mining has now come in. And finally, the destitution. No longer an economy of frugality, not even an economy of scarcity, but an economy of destitution, where the people are dependent upon world aid. So that is a kind of questioning, which is where we come to explore more deeply what deep ecology and ecofeminism are. Because as I asked myself, how can we stop this quarry? And at the same time, as Cynthia was indicating, I was also working on land reform on the neighboring island of Egg. How can we get the land back into the control of the people who live there, instead of being controlled by wealthy landowners, or lairds, as we call them in Scotland? And this was around the time that I met my good friend, John Seed. I think you may know this book, Thinking Like a Mountain, that he and Joanna Macy, who you've got this week also, Pat Fleming and Arnie Ness all contributed to. I had met John Seed through my work in Papua New Guinea on community-based timber production. I don't need to go into that just now. And that led me into starting to understand about deep ecology and ecofeminism. When I look back on it now, I think an important starting point was the 1972 Limits to Growth report, which basically said that population is going up and up, pollution is going up and up. And of course, now we understand CO2 pollution and greenhouse gases, and resources are going down and down. The Limits to Growth report was right in many respects. It was wrong in some respects. It predicted that resources would become more and more scarce. It failed to predict how deeper and deeper penetration of the industrial economy into indigenous lands would lead to extraction in ways that had not been understood in 1972. And so commodity prices are actually cheaper now than they were then for many metals. But at what cost? You know what cost. But the Limits to Growth report, and I began university studying environmental sciences in 1973. This was talked about a lot in my early formation then. We discussed it at great length in university. It had a major impact at the time. And I think it's no accident that the term deep ecology was first used the following year by Arnie Ness, and the term ecofeminism was first used the year after that by Françoise Dubonne of France in her book, Feminism or Death. Now, what is deep ecology? Drawing again from Arnie Ness's brilliant essay in Thinking Like a Mountain, and you can download this online if you don't have a hard copy. Arnie Ness said, deep ecology is about the self-realization, realization, to make real the self. And in the essay in that book, he defines the self as being the same as the Atman in Hinduism. Self is very deep soul that ultimately is connected to Brahman, the universal self, God, the Tao, the Buddha nature, the Christ. I live, yet not I, but Christ lives within me. You get the same understandings, in my view, in all of the mystical traditions. In self-realization of the ecological self, the self is widened and deepened so that protection of free nature is protection of our very selves. So Ness is basically asking the question, he asks the question, who are you? Who am I? At a surface level, we are ego. I am Alastair Mcintosh. I have written books like this. Look, there's my name, where is it? On the book. Ego, okay? Ego is okay. Ego is outward representation of the self. But if I start to think that my value is only in my outer life, in the things of the ego world, I lose connection with my soul, with the heart, with the divine. So when Arne Ness uses the word self, he uses it to mean the soul, the Atman, that connection with the divine. Self-realization is therefore the process of becoming more and more deeply conscious of our divine nature, our divine connection. And, says Arne Ness, that consciousness is connected in with the whole of creation. Therefore, the self is also the ecological self. You look up at the stars, and you are not separate from this universe, but you and I are part of this universe. Therefore, the self, the sense of self is widened because beyond the narrow ego of what it means to be Alastair Mcintosh. The sense of self is widened progressively to infinity, to eternity, and deepened, so that the protection of free nature, of wild nature, becomes the protection of our very selves. I would say that that is the essence of deep ecology. Beyond that, Ness, he's a philosopher of Spinoza. He becomes very philosophical and talks in very Western philosophical terms about it. But in that essay in John Seed's book, you've got a beautiful encapsulation of the spirituality of what he's talking about. And then in 1974, as we see, was the first use of the term ecofeminism by the French feminist thinker Françoise Daubonne in a book, Feminism and Istes. And I picked out this phrase of hers where she talks about men's ability to plant the seed in the earth as in women. That men's ability to plant seed in the earth, to take control of agriculture, parallels the ability to plant seed in women, to take control of women's fertility, and to recognize the common oppression of both the earth and of women by the power of men, by the power of patriarchy. Patri, to do with the fathers, archos, to do with ruling, patriarchy, male rule. To recognize the common oppression of the earth and the women by patriarchy and other domination systems such as racism, gender, social class, sexuality, etc. That these are why ecofeminist thought is important. Now, ecofeminism quickly took hold in the 1970s and 80s into the early 90s. Uh-oh, what's happened here? Oh, there we go. I would especially recommend anthologies like these two books here. And as it deepened, it very much became a spiritual expression. It became an expression. De Boon wasn't really interested in the spiritual side of things, as far as I can make out, but the later ecofeminists very much attached this to a recognition of the importance of the spiritual. That to become embodied in the earth is self-realization. That self-realization is of the Atman, of the Buddha nature, of the Christ within. And therefore it's a spiritual journey. And people like Starhawk here, who is a friend of ours, she stayed here in Scotland in 2005 when she was here for the G8 protests, brings that into the realm of activism, of empowerment. And I would recommend her book here, A Guide for Collaborative Groups. So you see where I'm getting at here, that deep ecology, connection with the earth, and an understanding of how women, racial minorities, etc., have also been oppressed. The oppression is coming from the same extractive domination system, which is often characterized as patriarchy. How far it's appropriate to blame that on men in general, or how far that is a social and historical thing is a matter of debate that I'm not going to go into just now. But one thing I would point out to you is that all the people I've mentioned just now, with the exception of Adrienne Rich, are white. And most of the writers in these books are North Americans. And what's been going on here has basically been a rediscovery by white folks of what patriarchy and domination systems have done to them, how they have disempowered us. And that's where work like this is very important. This was compiled by my late friend Darrell Posey for the United Nations Environment Programme. It's over 700 pages of writings by indigenous peoples from around the world. You can download this online. When I send Cynthia these slides later, I'll put a link in for it. And what you find in indigenous peoples is that everything that I've just said to you about deep ecology and ecofeminism is already understood by many, not all indigenous peoples, but by many. And we have to be careful about generalizing about indigenous peoples, and we have to be careful about glorifying indigenous peoples, because their societies often had problems and oppression too. In Papua New Guinea, they joke about it now, but they used to eat each other. We have to use wisdom. We have to say what is important from indigenous cultures, what is important from our past to carry forward into the future. But I just want to make the point here that so much of what I've just said can be found not just in the thinking of white philosophers or white feminists, but in the writings of the indigenous people like, where is she? And there we are. Viola Cordova there, the first Apache, the first Native American PhD in philosophy. In her book, How It Is a very good example of a powerful woman thinker, understanding how far ahead their indigenous thinking was compared with what she was being taught in Western philosophy classes. I want to come back to Arne Naess and also mention another American thinker, Aldo Leopold. Aldo Leopold came up with the expression thinking like a mountain, which John Seed and his colleagues borrowed in their book here. And remember, my concern here is about how do we save our mountain? How do we save our community that lives around the mountain? Naess said, the smaller we come to feel ourselves compared to the mountain, in other words, the more humble we are in relation to nature, the nearer we come into participating in its greatness. Carl Jung, the great Swiss psychotherapist, tells the story of a Jewish rabbi. And a young rabbi came to the old rabbi and said, Rabbi, in the past, people used to see God, but now they no longer see God. Why is that? And the old rabbi said, because these days, nobody is prepared to stoop low enough. Nobody's prepared to be humble enough to see God. The smaller we come to feel ourselves compared to the mountain, the nearer we come to participating in its greatness. Like a mountain, a song also known as You Can't Kill the Spirit by the Chicana, the Mexican-American songwriter Naomi Little Bear. I want you to imagine, this is early 1990s, and I've got all of that stuff running through my head as I'm one of the people in the community leading the campaign to save this mountain. And the question that I'm putting here is, where does the strength come from? This was a costly campaign. It and the campaign on egg caused me to lose my job teaching at Edinburgh University. It was a brutal era. It was costly, and yet it's shaped who I've become. And I'm suggesting to you that I was drawing strength from this understanding of deep ecology and of ecofeminism. And let's take a closer look at the medieval church, because in the tower there, you will see this figure here, which is actually a naked female figure having just given birth. There you see it. It's a particular characteristic of West of Scotland and Irish medieval churches, of Celtic medieval churches. Nobody quite understands why they were put there. I'm not going to get into that debate. But for me, I found it deeply symbolic that it was as if this woman is protecting the mountain. It was amazing. It just really fired up in me. And for me, it also tied in with our local legend and bride, a Christian saint, bride Bridget, as she's also known, Bríde in the indigenous Gaelic language, who used to be a Celtic goddess and then became a Christian saint. And here you see in the legends of our part of the world, her being carried by angels from the island of Iona to Bethlehem, where she became the foster mother of Christ, the foster mother of Christ. Now, in our tradition, to be a foster mother, to adopt a child, is even stronger than the blood connection. So what this does is it indigenizes the function of Mary into our culture. Notice the seagulls, which are now tradition, because they move between the air, the land, and the sea. They are the symbol of spiritual transformation. And St. Bridget, in her Irish form, I was describing her Scottish form there, but in her Irish form, she is the bearer of the sacred fire. She carries the fire. It is said that she turned back the streams of war. Notice how this is mixing together, you might say, the pagan with the Christian and with the shamanic function of the fire. And to me, this is liberation theology. This is theology that liberates theology to do what it should be doing. Whether you're talking Christian theology, but for other traditions too, Gandhi doing it very much with Hinduism, taking what is in those teachings and bringing it into modern context. Notice how Jesus is in the modern Chico Mendes, the murdered Brazilian rubber tappers leader, the rainforest being destroyed in the same way as Jesus was stripped of his clothes so that the Romans would gamble with them. Jeremiah, I brought you into plentiful land, but you made my heritage. Working in a Muslim context, as I do with West Papua, sometimes you can draw the same liberation theology from Islamic teachings. Allah made the earth, made it beautiful, yet most people give no thanks. We don't complete the cycles of gratitude. So back again to Scotland, and I found myself drawing, this is actually on the island of Egg, Maggie Fife and Camille Dressler there. I found myself drawing more and more on the power and communities it actually looks like. Look at this. This is from the island of Egg again, when people were debating how to get their land back, just before the landlord tried to evict them. And notice how this is a very difficult meeting. Look at the stress in people's faces. Look at the amount of alcohol on the table. But notice the inner circle is the women. The men are on the outside. It is the women who are really doing the core community thinking in that image. Very subtle ways. Sometimes you only have a teaspoon. Sometimes you've got very little power, but you can use it to dig channels, which then widen so that a mighty river starts to flow. As I wrestled with how to go deeper with the super quarry, arguing about community, about economy, biodiversity and so on wasn't going to be enough, I moved the debate into the spiritual territory. And around that time, I started to get a lot of imagery of Native Americans and eagles. Somebody sent me this card with the eagle. And this one here, my realization that in our Celtic tradition, the eagle also plays a very important role in our traditional artwork. It was Chief Stone Eagle of the Mi'kmaq in Nova Scotia, who had stopped a similar quarry, or it was going to hold an inquiry into the supermarket. So to cut a long story short, I brought Stone Eagle over to Scotland. And there we are at the mountain. The purpose of this was so that that's us at the government public inquiry. It produced huge publicity because we spiritualized it. Inquiry asked to consider God's opinion of the super quarry. Bond between man and the land gets an airing. You see the deep ecology becoming popularized in the press there. Before he left to go back to Nova Scotia, a community elder, an elder both of the church and in a wider sense, John Macaulay, a boat builder here, handed me this rock. He said, "Give this to Stone Eagle. It is the summit rock of the mountain of Mount Rainival." The next day I gave it to him at the Callanish Standing Stones. This looks like a painting rather than a photograph. It's really a photograph, but it got damaged by water and the colors flowed and it's made it wonderful. There he is holding the rock. He said, "I can't accept this as a gift, but I'll take it into sanctuary until your mountain is saved." Notice this, the power of story, the power of symbolism in that. He took it and he deposited it in the museum, the Hector Heritage Quay Museum, in a replica of the emigrant ship that took immigrants evicted from their land by landlords in Scotland over to Nova Scotia in the 1800s. What then happened is, because of the bad publicity that we managed to generate, the share price of Redland, the company that was then called, started to go down. And Redland got taken over by another company, Lafarge. So we were then dealing no longer with an English company, but with a French company. There was a massive local swing of opinion against the super quarry because the public inquiry showed people the damage it was really going to do. And so the islanders withdrew their support. The company attempted bribery, but all of that backfired because we exposed it. And to cut a long story short, the mountain was saved. I'm just going to push on a little bit. There was one thing, I had to go and get the rock back. So I went over to Nova Scotia in 2004, and the Mi'kmaq people, Marcella here, and this is the town council leader, put on a ceremony where they organized a sweat lodge and returned the mountain to me. We then took it back to Harris. A group of us climbed the mountain. There's my wife, Feren. There's Alec George, my friend who I showed you earlier, and my other friend, Rusty from the village. And folks, this is what a shaman looks like. He's an elder in the Christian church. He's a boat builder. But this man is a shaman, in my opinion, the shaman of the community. That's the summit rock. These are other rocks that became part of the process. And so he symbolically stuck the rock back on in place after the mountain had been saved. And there you have it. And so today I am able to take groups like the folk from West Papua and other parts of Indonesia here. I'm able to take them to here, and John here he's very old now, he's quite ill. He wouldn't be able to come out of the house much now. But he, at this time in 2019, he was able to tell them the story. No land, no life. Community can do it. Government must support. So this is cross-cultural learning coming out of it. Understanding how change has affected our communities. Look at this image here. The woman has come back to the village after being away in the city. I use this to ask, how do the people in the village feel about her? How does she feel about herself? Same thing in the Solomon Islands, in Papua New Guinea, question man. One side of him is a traditional man with traditional activities. The other side is a Western man in a suit. Always a question in development. Does it give life? I've set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life so that you and your children may live, says God in Deuteronomy 30. Does it give life? What kind of development? Ask yourself, does it give life? Notice much of what I've been doing here. Remembering that which has been dismembered, remembering what we have lost, remembering the state we are in, revisioning how the future could be, and reclaiming needed to bring it about. How do you do that in practice? Again, I learned so much from the South Pacific, social cosmology, an exercise in villages where people would discuss sense of space before white man and after white man, as they call colonization, time, knowledge, people to nature, people to each other, and people to God. And in 2019, when the West Papuans were here, we had them do these past, present, and future exercises. How was it in the past? What is happening now? What are the future options? In the past, we had our village life. In the present, we have people coming along trying to change that. How are we going to choose? What will Question Man choose? Will Question Man choose a way of life that maintains community of place, or which betrays community of place, so that the place gets taken over by the tourist industry and big companies? Same with culture and history, past, present. What's the future going to be? You see how this helps to wake people up. Language. In the past, we had our own language. Now, the beach that had a local name is now called Melissa's Garden because the tourists like that kind of name. Governance. Is it going to be communities making decisions about communities? Or is money going to corrupt the process? Are we going to work together? Or are we going to end up competing and fighting each other, driven by rupees, driven by money? Economy. Is our economy going to be based on sharing, or is it going to be based on money, where instead of ending up in an integrated village with integrated human development, we end up working as servants in a hotel, feeding the tourists? And spirituality. In the past, our traditional spiritualities, religion in Papua becoming corrupted by money, the prosperity gospel. Are we going to have a future with the kind of spirituality we choose, or is it going to be the spirituality of the shopping mall, where money buys consumer goods and money buys salvation, buying a stairway to heaven? And I found it wonderful the way these folk adapted that. This is Alex Rumaseb, who led the West Papuan delegations, and he's taken my wife's work on collaborative leadership and written that into a little book in Indonesian. And then he's also written one based on liberation theology. Wonderful to see that happening. Notice how I've taken the photograph so that one of our indigenous animals, the hare, is there as well. We have seen that people here, the people in Scotland, have two things that make their communities work: love and a sense of ownership. Because these people love so much, it holds it all together. They are happy to live for other people and not just for themselves. They understand that land is God's creation. Carl Jung, the upheaval of our world and the upheaval of our consciousness are one and the same. Go to bed, think on your problems, see what you dream. I have a dream, said Martin Luther King. See what you dream. Perhaps the great man, the great woman, the 2 million year old woman, 2 million year old man will speak only in a cul-de-sac, only when you're stuck, only when you know that your ego self is not going to be enough, that you must deepen into that deep self, into the Atman, into the Tao. Do you hear the voice of truth speaking? Thank you, friends.
Hi, Alastair. I'm Sumi. I'm from Malaysia.
Hi.
I was curious about something that you shared early on where you said that your community didn't realize it was Indigenous Scottish. Like in other countries, we hear more about protection of Indigenous customs, or what was going on for your community that I mean, in Scotland, was there no protection for Indigenous communities or no sort of campaign to bring that out more? What was going on around that? Thanks.
I think you know, we were raised in the colonial mindset. We were raised, when I was at primary school, the map on the wall was of the British Empire, and the empire was still being lost. And we had been colonized internally. We use the term internal colonization. In Scotland, we often say we're colonized by the English. But it wasn't just the English, it was basically the social class of wealthy people who realized they could enrich themselves by kicking people off the land and taking it over. But we weren't allowed to talk about it. We were never taught about the fact. I mean, I showed you there the pictures of my great-great-grandparents. Where are we? And there's my twice great-grandfather and his daughter, my great-grandmother. And his father's people were kicked off the land brutally. It said that this book here, A History of the Working Classes of Scotland. I mean, their name was MacLennan. And he says here, the evictions of Clan MacLennan from Strathconnan, which is near Inverness, by the Balfour trustees. This is Balfour of the family, Arthur Balfour, the British Prime Minister, were carried out in a most barbarous manner. And to this day, the spot is shown where the dispossessed men and women crouched together, praying rather for a merciful death than that they should be driven further from the place of their birth. And just this week, I met a man called Col Gordon at an event, and he came up to me and he said, it was my family, the Gordons, who took over the land that your people were evicted from. And only now are we recognizing and talking about these things. And of course, we laughed about it. And we said how wonderful that now, only now, do we have a new generation of young scholars doing their PhDs, where they're able to use the C word. I talk about the C word. I don't mean a vulgar word like cunt. I mean colonization. In the past, we couldn't talk about it. In the past, it was denied. So we were raised in that mindset, you see. And I think perhaps my generation, I was born in 1955, were the first to both be able to travel a lot and to live in other cultures and to come back and to start to open up a space where we could talk about these things. That's what's happened. Does that answer your question?
My name's Elan. I was wondering about the impact on your community after they saved the mountain. That must have had an impact on the community going forward. Can you describe a little bit, sort of post saving the mountain, how that might have actualized in other ways? Yeah.
It's so beautiful. It's so beautiful what's happened, because I mentioned that in parallel to the Harris campaign, I was also working on the island of Egg, and we managed to get the island out of private ownership and into community ownership. I'm not going to have time this morning to explain to you how we did that. It's what I write about in Soil and Soul. By the way, if any of you know a Chinese publisher who might be interested in translating Soil and Soul, that would be wonderful. TV rights have just been sold for it in the UK, so hopefully something might be coming on that, but it'd be wonderful to get it into other languages. And oh dear, sorry, I lost the thread of your question again. Just come back to me again. There.
The community, after they've come together and they've
afterwards.
The mountain.
So what's happened is that the land reform movement has become infectious. We've now got about 400 land trusts in Scotland.
Woo!
Yeah, you've got about 400 land trusts holding about something like 400,000 acres of land.
Wow.
Yeah, it's so beautiful. I'm just well, let's just see if I can show you anything of that. No, I've not got it to hand. Okay, I'm not going to be able to quickly pull up slides on that. But basically what's happening now in these places is that quite a large part of Harris and most of Lewis is now community owned. And when that happens, people are able to build housing that they can afford to live in. So, there's been a huge housing problem because these are beautiful areas. So all the tourists and holidaymakers, they want to buy second homes there, and that squeezes out the local people. But with land reform, the community is building new villages for local people to live in. We call it social affordable housing. They're able to tap into renewable energy, hydroelectric, wind power, and use the benefits for the community. So we have one community that has put up 3 wind turbines. They're producing £1 million. That's $1.2 million a year in profit. And that gets distributed to community causes. And they're able to start up small businesses. When I went to get that photograph, I had to move aside this bottle because that's a bottle from the brewery on Egg, started by 2 young men. And it's featuring one of the land reform figures. In fact, the husband of Maggie Fife, who you saw there, Wes Fife. All kinds of small businesses, ecotourism businesses, electronics businesses, software businesses, and so on. People living in the land and small business units. And all of that builds competence in the community. When you ask people why they're doing it in our part of the world, they say, I'm doing it for the community. They're not just doing it for themselves, they're doing it for the community. But it also helps themselves. It's got to help themselves so they can carry on living there. So it's really beautiful what is unfolding. And goodness me, I mean, you then get the young folk coming forward. They're now doing their PhDs and so on. They're now becoming counselors and so on in the community. And they've grown up with this. And it's transforming at a slow pace, at a gentle pace. Remember that image of the teaspoon digging. At a gentle space, it opens out possibility of vision. Next person. Interesting if we establish it deeply, if we examine it deeply. First of all, in order to have this meeting, they had to get permission from the landowner. because this is a tea room and shop that the landowner controlled. So even before we could meet, we had to get his permission, or they had to ask his permission to have a meeting. And you'll notice what a state it is in. You know, there were 1 or 2 postcards on sale, but it's basically neglected. I mean, this is now a beautiful community center, but it's just total neglect. Secondly, notice the amount of alcohol, all the beer on the table, because in those days, a lot of people wouldn't feel able to speak unless they had 1 or 2 drinks of alcohol. This again is a feature of a colonized people. What's happening here is that the 2 most powerful women, or the 3 most powerful women in here, Maggie Fife, who became secretary of the Land Reform Trust, Leslie Ridder, a journalist with both the BBC and the Scotsman newspaper, and Camille Dressler, the historian who wrote the book on eggs history. Where have you gone, Camille? Oh dear, I'm not doing very well at finding my books today, am I? Here she is. Here she is. So, you know, this is a very important function, to write the history of a people. And Camille is French, but she went and married and settled in Egg, an ethnographer by training. And what's happening in that meeting is, notice this woman here, Sheena. The night before the meeting, Schellenberg, the landowner on Egg, knew that they were going to discuss whether or not to support the trust that we had set up. And Schellenberg phoned her up and said, tell them that if they continue to support the Land Reform Trust, I will refuse permission for the old people's sheltered housing. So what people are discussing here is whether or not to continue with land reform, or whether to accept the consent for the old people's housing. Their decision in the end was to ask the old people, and the old people said, carry on with the land reform. What's going on here is that Maggie is actually from the north of England. She came to settle in Egg, but because she was an outsider who came onto the inside, she had both an outsider's and an insider's point of view and skills. So she played and continues to play a very central role. She's the grandmama, the big mama of that community. Leslie, as a journalist, was able to help people to find their voice. A good journalist helps to get people talking. Leslie helped people to find their voice. This was the last of these trust meetings that had all the alcohol. After that, they decided they weren't going to have alcohol until after the meeting was over. So you've got the inner circle of women really making the decisions. But when the TV cameras would turn up, when the reporters from the mainland would turn up, they would talk to the men. Colin Carr, the farmer, would normally be the spokesperson to the media. So to the outside world, it was male leadership, it was patriarchy. But on the inner circle, you could say it was matriarchy. And I find it very revealing. I find it very revealing that in most of our community land trusts now, it's women that are playing the prominent leadership role. There is something that is, when it is about the land, when it is about communities of place, that encourages women to step forward and take a leadership role. And I think there again, you see the power of ecofeminism. You see the power of a feminist critique of, or a feminist engagement with land coming into play. I often joke, you know, I get asked to speak on many different kinds of platforms. And very often they'll say, well, you know, we've got 3 men and we need to find a woman, or we need to find a woman for the first person on the panel. And they will have difficulty finding a woman who can speak to it, but there is an exception. If it is about land reform in Scotland, you have more difficulty finding the men than the women. We have a lot of really empowered women in Scotland now coming out of the land reform movement.
The experience it had, but one picture that I kind of stuck with me was the women that was having the discussion with the men around, you mentioned, with all the wine. I was wondering, in terms of the internal power, is it always that women are being respected, or how is that? Can you elaborate more on how women become empowered, or they have always been the center of this kind of nurturing and becoming leaders in the community, in your community?
Interesting if we establish it deeply, if we examine it deeply. First of all, in order to have this meeting, they had to get permission from the landowner, because this is a tea room and shop that the landowner controlled. So even before we could meet, we had to get his permission, or they had to ask his permission to have a meeting. And you'll notice what a state it is in. You know, there were 1 or 2 postcards on sale, but it's basically neglected. I mean, this is now a beautiful community center, but it's just total neglect. Secondly, notice the amount of alcohol, all the beer on the table, because in those days, a lot of people wouldn't feel able to speak unless they had 1 or 2 drinks of alcohol. This again is a feature of a colonized people. What's happening here is that the 2 most powerful women, or the 3 most powerful women here, Maggie Fife, who became secretary of the Land Reform Trust, Leslie Riddoch, a journalist with both the BBC and the Scotsman newspaper, and Camille Dressler, the historian who wrote the book on eggs history. Where have you gone, Camille? Oh dear, I'm not doing very well at finding my books today, am I? Here she is. Here she is. So, you know, this is a very important function, to write the history of a people. And Camille is French, but she went and married and settled in Egg, an ethnographer by training. And what's happening in that meeting is, notice this woman here, Sheena. The night before the meeting, Schellenberg, the landowner on Egg, knew that they were going to discuss whether or not to support the trust that we had set up. And Schellenberg phoned her up and said, tell them that if they continue to support the Land Reform Trust, I will refuse permission for the old people's sheltered housing. So what people are discussing here is whether or not to continue with land reform, or whether to accept the consent for the old people's housing. Their decision in the end was to ask the old people, and the old people said, carry on with the land reform. What's going on here is that Maggie is actually from the north of England. She came to settle in Egg, but because she was an outsider who came onto the inside, she had both an outsider's and an insider's point of view and skills. So she played and continues to play a very central role. She's the grandmama, the big mama of that community. Leslie, as a journalist, was able to help people to find their voice. A good journalist helps to get people talking. Leslie helped people to find their voice. This was the last of these trust meetings that had all the alcohol. After that, they decided they weren't going to have alcohol until after the meeting was over. So you've got the inner circle of women really making the decisions. But when the TV cameras would turn up, when the reporters from the mainland would turn up, they would talk to the men. Colin Carr, the farmer, would normally be the spokesperson to the media. So to the outside world, it was male leadership, it was patriarchy. But on the inner circle, you could say it was matriarchy. And I find it very revealing. I find it very revealing that in most of our community land trusts now, it's women that are playing the prominent leadership role. There is something that is, when it is about the land, when it is about communities of place, that encourages women to step forward and take a leadership role. And I think there again, you see the power of ecofeminism. You see the power of a feminist critique of, or feminist engagement with the land coming into play. I often joke, you know, I get asked to speak on many different kinds of platforms. And very often they'll say, well, you know, we've got 3 men and we need to find a woman, or we need to find a woman for the first person on the panel. And they will have difficulty finding a woman who can speak to it. But there is an exception. If it is about land reform in Scotland, you have more difficulty finding the men than the women. We have a lot of really empowered women in Scotland now coming out of the land reform movement.
Thank you so much, Alastair.
Thank you,
That was
folks. Go
just
well. And I wish
beautiful.
you well with the rest of your journey with Vandana and Joanna and I don't know the African. Yes, I've not come across him before, but I know his work is important to my colleague Jahan, who with her husband Colin founded the Galgale Trust. So his work is important to her, but it's not work that I know. Go well. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.